¿Cómo están? ¿Cómo estamos? Ya llegamos, casi, al fin del día. Gracias por tantas ponencias brillantes, conversaciones intensas. Gracias por todo. Les voy a dar mi ponencia en inglés, como a muchos, pero les puedo contestar en español también. This talk is a little piece of my forthcoming book. The book is called Indignant Liberalism, Protest, Political Change, and the Post-War Generation of El Salvador. It traces the line from liberal expectations to authoritarian promises in El Salvador, following young urban activists who came of political age around 2011. Remember that year? It examines how liberalism's tensions underlie many of our lived realities today. Okay. The protesters that I came to know were fighting for the promises of liberal democracy. Specifically, the Salvadoran indignados, as they called themselves after the Spanish indignados, wanted the Salvadoran state to protect the integrity of their country's Supreme Court. The Legislative Assembly had passed a decree that rendered toothless the judicial authority. It required all rulings on constitutionality to be unanimous, an unprecedented constraint. The indignados demanded the decree's repeal. And in fact, it was overturned a few months later. With time, while carrying out this research and indeed living in the world in the past decade, I have become more sympathetic to those hoping to redeem liberalism's promissory note. But we must reckon with the consequences of classic liberalism's imaginary social contract, to which so many of us have thought that we were bound. Such a recognition could help us understand the rise of populist authoritarian politics in recent years. History shows us that liberal modes of institutional power have always led to, if not ensured, unequal outcomes. And I follow the Jamaican-American philosopher Charles Mills in my books, the larger books analysis. Mills contends that all liberalism has been sealed with a metaphorical racial contract. That's Mills here. Mills says the most famous documents of liberal modernity are primarily about property white males' liberations, not anybody else's. If you add together the exclusion clauses of liberalism's most celebrated manifestos, treatises, and declarations of human rights, you get a litany of oppressions rather than a list of emancipations. The majority of the population of El Salvador may have emerged with more freedoms after the 12-year civil war ended in 1992, but they were not emancipated. Many live in poverty, and liberal visions of freedom and flourishing were distant future imaginaries in their daily lives, which were increasingly surrounded by violence after the war. Mills, I should add, always held out hope that the ideals of liberalism would overcome its contradictions once we acknowledge them. And I may be beating a dead horse here. You might say, don't we know this already? The failure of liberalism, and here, of course, I'm talking about the perspective from the left, not that of the reactionaries in power. Among the factors that pushed me towards this analysis was first, the interest of my own anthropology students in alternative indigenous epistemologies, even though they didn't really understand most of their own ways of knowing and being in the world, usually liberalism in that sort of classic Enlightenment sense. That's what I'm talking about, that kind of rule of law, private property, institutional integrity, liberty, we talked about earlier, free market, all these things, rational thinking, against authoritarianism, all those kind of Enlightenment things. So it's kind of our ontology in the West, in the United States. But the students sort of didn't even want to review that. They kind of were interested in other ontologies. And it's like, we've got to know ourselves too. We're all different. And then, of course, there is the rise of illiberalism, the populist authoritarianism around the globe. which smashes against liberal habitus and liberal institutions, right? So I suggest in this book that the rise of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador must be a symptom of some of the failures of liberalism. This paper is taken from a chapter of the book that discusses generation and memory in Salvadoran history. At its core are stories shared by two members of this paper that I'm giving you, are stories shared by two members of this new generation of activists, as well as reflections of an earlier generation. If we think of liberalism as a form of engagement rather than just a political ideology or an orientation contained within individual subjects, then following the ways people engage with the past, with memories, offers us a way to understand political change. Liberal ways of seeing and being in the world permeated the 2011, 2012 urban middle class activists, those indignados of El Salvador. It permeated their political trajectories. I've kept in touch with a lot of the activists, and some of them now support President Bukele, but many of them recoil, it's being recorded, many of them recoil at what his administration has done, including effectively firing all of the judges of the constitutional wing of the Supreme Court to replace them with loyalists, and imposing through the legislature the anti-gang state of exception, which suspends constitutional protections and has resulted in countless arbitrary arrests and the highest incarceration rate in the world. I call these activists part of the post-war generation to differentiate them from their older brothers and sisters, as well as from their parents who either remember the war clearly or lived the struggles. Karen, one of the people that I have engaged with over the years and who is now a journalist, organized a major protest in 2012 called the Zapatazo Limpio, in which youth threw shoes at the Legislative Assembly building. And so she calls this generation la generación de quiebre, the rupture generation. And she characterizes her cohort, this post-war generation, which she estimated to be born between about 1985, which was her birth year, and 1992. She characterizes them as having barely experienced the war with very little memories. They didn't feel, thus, she says, the political allegiances of their parents. So we'll return to her story in a minute. The first story, though, that I'll share is that of Miguel Marmol, Salvadoran communist shoemaker, thus not a liberal, but born in a world of dominant liberal ontologies. His perspective and story help us contextualize Salvadoran generation and memory and help us theorize from within that country's political experience. Anyone familiar with Miguel Marmol? Some of you must be. Yes, the Salvadoranists there. This is a picture from a recent illustrated comic novel that's taken from a book called Los 12 Nacimientos de Miguel Marmol, the 12 rebirths or births of Miguel Marmol. The book was, these ideas are from Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano, who anointed Marmol the old master of constant rebirth. And this is in his historical trilogy, Galeano's historical trilogy, Memory of Fire. So rebirth for Galeano means evading extinction. Marmol, who he writes about, is best known for evading extinction in the 1932 massacre of at least 10,000 mostly indigenous protesters after a communist-led uprising. Galeano reviews a number, then after kind of going over that, he reviews a number of other rebirths, the 12 rebirths in Marmol's life. A key moment came when Marmol was 13 in 1918. He had been working in the National Guard barracks. Right after he quit his job there, an earthquake crushed the building, killing the soldiers and officers inside. Marmol told Roque Dalton, the testimonial from which all this information about Marmol's life came is called Miguel Marmol by the poet Roque Dalton, and this is a picture of them in Prague talking about what they were going to do in the book. So Marmol had been working, as he told Dalton, as a flunky for a guardsman. And He said he'd left the job that day before the earthquake because drunken soldiers had beat him, but also, more importantly, they had tortured prisoners, including one that he personally knew, who was a decent person, he said. So Marmo would point to this moment as coming of political age for him. Within a few years, he'd become a communist organizer. Police and military would be at his heels for the rest of his life. Another way of thinking about rebirth is generational renewal. We're reborn through our children, and as elders, our memories take us on new lives as we pass on our stories. Miguel Marmol, now gone for decades, is reborn as new generations learn about his life, read his words, learn about his life and the turbulent history that shaped it. So the memory of those who struggled, whether in a revolt that turned into a massacre or a 12-year civil war, can cast long shadows on the next generations, as Holocaust scholar Marianne Hirsch argues in theorizing what she calls post-memory, to grow up with overwhelming inherited memories, to be dominated by narratives that preceded one's birth or one's consciousness, is to risk having one's life stories displaced, even evacuated by our ancestors. So the post-war generation of the early 2010s were trying to break from the war era political polarization, sort of left and right, the FMLN izquierda on the left, the Arena on the right, just very, very polarized. So they were trying to break from that. Many leaders of the generation that fought the war or endured it or watched from exile had only really, in this time, around 2011, they had only really just grudgingly acknowledged youth, insisting that the new class of political activists, these protesters, had to wait their turn. It wasn't time yet. Theorists of generation, following Karl Mannheim, often point to formative memories of key events or distinct time periods as shifting a generational ethos. While Mannheim points to the importance of shared collective memory in forming a political generation, liberal common sense understanding of remembering is individualized. Even Miguel Marmol's story of coming to political consciousness in the National Guard barracks is individualized. But the mutual recognition among resistors in the 1920s is what brought them together in a radical generation in El Salvador, the previous 100 years ago generation. So when I began some conversations with some of El Salvador's young middle-class activists of the post-war generation, at first I was looking for new revolutionaries. I didn't quite recognize their liberal logics. Initially, I was interested in their resistance to what they saw as war-era polarization. Many Salvadorans do see Cold War-formed politics as a key marker of historically located ways of experiencing the world. The difference is their relationship to that marker, right? Post-war generations, elders lived the war, the new generation mostly had not. As the father of the journalist, Karen, told me, commenting on her decision to leave her office early, before the day was over, which was an affront to him and to his, to the family. They were hardworking, middle-class people. So when he commented on her decision to protest at the Legislative Assembly, he said, she makes these decisions and protests and everything, but she doesn't have the point of view of those who lived before and during the war. And we have lived through all these political, social, and economic problems that this country has had. She didn't live it. So already he's like, he's worried, he's upset about her, but he's like, she doesn't understand. She hasn't lived the way we have. This I heard a lot at the time and around that time. So let me tell you a little bit about what many of these activists do remember about the war, focusing on the stories from two of them, Karen, who we've already met, and Alejandro, another activist. The world remembers 1989, November 1989, for the fall of the Berlin Wall. It represented both the symbolic end of the Cold War and imagined global triumph of liberalism. In El Salvador, that moment is remembered for La Ofensiva, the offensive. Childhood memories of La Ofensiva may crystallize differences between the generations. At least that's what I'm arguing here. On November 11th, 1989, the FMLN guerrilla forces invaded the San Salvador metropolitan area. The event shocked the more comfortable capitalinos, the people who lived in the capital, because the brunt of the civil war had actually taken place in rural areas or the urban margins. The government declared a state of siege and a curfew, and 5 days later, an elite military unit would break into the Central American University, La UCA, and murder 6 Jesuit priests along with their housekeeper and her daughter. Fighting intensified in the capital, with FMLN insurgents eventually holding hostages in the Hotel Sheraton in a wealthy neighborhood. Peace negotiations between the guerrilla forces and the government recommenced and accelerated after the fighting ended in December. Most of the middle-class activists I knew would eventually mention La Ofensiva in our conversations. Some of them remembered it, or maybe they remembered stories that friends or family members had shared. Parents or older brothers and sisters who I talked to also were more likely to point to the shared terror or broader meanings of La Ofensiva. In contrast, the post-war generation Salvadorans narrate La Ofensiva as intimate, personal, contained within the private property that was supposed to keep them safe, suggesting a return in the imagined safety of post-war to a more liberal, individualist way of being. So back to Karen. She and I first arranged to meet in a Pizza Hut in a very shopping mall, Las Cascadas. When we first spoke in 2013, Karen, who was then 27, was working for an NGO that encouraged environmental responsibility among businesses. I don't remember the war, she said. I remember La Ofensiva of 1989. We were living in Santa Tecla. Santa Tecla is the city of the middle class. In 1989, I was 4 years old. And for me, La Ofensiva was un momento chivo, a cool moment. All my uncles came and my grandmother, and we were together in one house, and we got our mattresses out and the lights went out. I mean, for me, it was a time to jump on mattresses. I do remember when they killed the Jesuits because my mother studied in the UCA. And I do have a memory of seeing the impact on her because they had killed her professors. And I remember the soldiers because they began to enter Santa Tecla. And I remember the war tanks, but it's not a painful memory. It's different how we feel about the war. She wasn't proposing that the blurred experience of the war determined her urban middle-class generation's identity. Rather, I think she was suggesting that these softer, intimate individual memories might open her cohort to other perspectives. The war did not define them the way it did their predecessors. Members of the post-war generation sought individual understandings of their particular context. I'd later talk to Karen's parents in a cappuccino-fueled conversation in Cafe Viva Espresso, which is in La Gran Via, a mock European street of boutiques and restaurants built on the grounds of a former coffee plantation. As her father indicated, as I mentioned earlier in this talk, their formative memories contrast dramatically with those of their daughter, setting up some of those generational differences. While Karen recalled her uncles gathered for protection and mattress jumping fun in the family home, her parents remembered imprisonments and murders of relatives and friends. When I was a little girl, her mother said, I remember the political campaigns that my uncles participated in and that they were always in prison. Her mother was from Acatao in Chalatenango, and if you know something about El Salvador, you know that's a very conflicted area. The National Guard would arrest these brothers for spreading propaganda, for putting up posters, just to shut them up. That's what Karen's mother said. Later, Karen's mother's cousins would join the guerrilla. One aunt lost 4 of her 6 sons in the war. And Karen's father's first political memory was the murder of a friend's father, a politician. He said, they killed him for not agreeing. And one of our family members, also a teacher, they disappeared him. The police came to my street dressed as civilians to look for neighbors. So I lived, maybe not with fear, but I realized what was happening. He, in fact, didn't join the guerrilla. He said because he had to support his family. He said, when they killed people, when they killed the Jesuits, when they killed Oscar Arnulfo Romero, all these things infuriated me too, but no, I was never disposed to join the guerrilla. Friends in my barrio disappeared for getting involved with the guerrilla. Or for sympathizing with them. Karen's mother chimed in that conversation. He agreed. If they found a book of Marx or Lenin, that was enough for them to kill you. Or if you listened to the music of the Venezuelan group Los Guaraguao, that was enough for the police to grab you and disappear you. Her parents did take Karen to demonstrations. They spoke of the past, but Karen said they did not smoothly transmit her memories that converted her into her political convictions. She said, I think it's impossible to dialogue, for example, with my mother, to talk about the Frente, the FMLN, as an obsolete party now, and this was in 2013. I'm struck by Karen's prescience in the 2024 elections that happened last year. No FMLN candidates were elected to the Legislative Assembly. The formative event in Karen's own life, she said, was the before and after, as she describes it, was her volunteer work for Techo, a nonprofit founded in Chile in 1997 to bring often middle-class university youth to build emergency housing in poor communities. She said, even though I feel like my parents, with all their formation on the left and everything, they had really sensitized me to poverty, but I had never gone for a week in a poor community, never. She was shocked to see how people actually lived. It's that they make garbage into houses, she said. They were casas de cartón, the cardboard houses, she said, echoing this anthem by the Guaraguao, the group her father loved. Her solution then to poverty was not a revolution, but a robust civil society in which some people volunteered to build more homes within the framework of a liberal democracy. Karen's parents linked their convictions to their collective, the family and the community, their collective experiences of war, terror, and repression. They also spoke of their economic limitations. They worked hard to rise above poverty. Her father went to night school. He did not join the guerrilla. Karen's difference then would not only be her cohort's distinct experiences of war and post-war, but her youthful sense of security that allowed her to imagine her formation as individual and chosen. She felt she had the right as an individual to express her political opinions and to freely make demands of the liberal democratic state. Alejandro, my second person. Alejandro, an environmental activist, was born in 1983. He also had only vague memories of war. It wasn't marcante, it wasn't defining for him. He said, I'm a child of the peace accords more than of the war. He recalled moments, he said, people running in the street when there were battles, blackouts. The clearest memory I have are two. One is La Ofensiva. I remember the sounds, the bullets, the darkness. We hid under the stairs. And the other one is when a stray bullet broke into a window in the house. And that's it. Those are the most powerful things that I remember. And then I remember the images of when they signed the peace accords on television, my parents crying. Alejandro may have been, a child of that peace, but what he often felt were the chills of generational shadows. In his experience, war-era activists and combatants could not make room for new people or new ideas. The Environmental Alliance, he said, doesn't have anyone young. This was in 2013, right? Or 14. The Mesa, or the Water Forum, no youth protagonism. It's an adult-centric space. What that means is the only kind of experience that matters to them is combat in the war. The NGOs, they're people who are organized and think they're still the insurgents. The problem is, I felt like it was just in tope, a ceiling from someone like me. There was a clear limit. I would think of his comments, which as I said, were from 2012, when we first met up a few years later. In 2014, we began talking about how at that year, these were the elections for mayor, San Salvador mayor, and Norman Quijano, who was the mayor and was about to leave office, had spoken contemptuously of the then mayoral candidate, Nayib Bukele. Quijano said Bukele was muy jovencito, too much of a youngster to lead the capital city. Bukele and his fans followed up with delighted memes about youth and youngsters. They refused the generational shadows of the war-era generation that the war-era generation was trying to cast upon them. Alejandro, though in that conversation critical of Bukele, recognized the feeling. It didn't matter to Alejandro whether Quijano was old or Bukele was young. What he saw was a distinction based on generations. For me, he said, the difference between adults and youth in this country is not as much age, but process. The political process that these adults lived in and the political process that today's young people and not so young people have had. What political education have we had, he said. In comparison with the adults before who made the war, who formed the NGOs, wow, big difference. Alejandro's participation in social movements was not casual. It was a deliberate choice. It was a rational, deliberate choice. And we just want to use that liberal frame. He made that choice actually while he was living in France, where he had lived for 2 years on a teaching exchange. He could have stayed in Europe, he said. He liked it there. But I had a strong desire to return to my country, he said, to contribute, even if it might seem romantic or utopian and everything. He pointed to his Jesuit education as foundational. I studied with Jesuits all my life, he said, in high school and the university. Critical thinking has not been far from my formation. So of course, you see how the history of colonialism has been in terms of the construction of the country, a paradigm of development, and then industrialization. You see what it's meant for the country, what it meant to be a military country in a dictatorship. So I saw, no, when he was sitting in France reading about all this, he said, I couldn't be anywhere else in the world but my country. This careful contemplation likely pushed Alejandro beyond the liberal limits of many of his indignado friends. Like many people that I interviewed, Alejandro has been invited to participate in countless leadership forums and workshops where NGOs teach them to develop critical capacities to make their own proposals. He attended some, he even led some, but he became doubtful. He did not want to fortify the institutions rooted in the racial liberalism of the 19th century. He eventually dropped out of the Indignados movement. Why would I participate? When we participate, we find we find ourselves obligated to reproduce the same model. Why? They're just plugging more of us into the hole of liberal democracy. He recalled the experience of a friend who had recently participated in the United Nations Global Forum on Youth. He said, "What's the objective of having youth even participate? To legitimate their model?" I expected that he was going to say, his friend, I expected he was going to say stuff like, well, let's attack the system. But he took a position like, youth are the present and we're going to make the change because of hope, etc. Alejandro paused. What the fuck? He took a breath. He recognized the political opening at that moment, 2012, 13, 14, which allowed him and his activist friends to speak and to act, but he didn't trust it. I can't say that there's a military dictatorship now that doesn't let us organize. That's bullshit. Here we can participate in everything. We can organize in everything. And no one's going to say anything. That was then. Right? But he concluded, nothing's going to change if we don't change ourselves. People don't organize. We can't keep believing in messiahs, in a hero, in a cacique, in some kind of leader that's going to save us. In retrospect, Alejandro's words, like Karen's, were prophetic. After 2019, Nayib Bukele, the messianic philosopher king, the self-anointed world's coolest dictator, began closing the aperture of activism that I was working in 2011 to 14. He's spying on journalists, threatening human rights activists, persecuting his political enemies, dismantling the justice system. Galeano's, these are just some more pictures of the protesters. These are the shoe throwers here. Galeano's story of the old master of constant rebirth, Miguel Mármol, reminds us of the ways social movements and political action ebb and flow over time and across generations. The vague memories of war Salvadoran middle-class activists shared, contrasting with their parents' struggles, suggests a complicated process of coming to political awareness. Their accounts focus on individual experiences of recognition of a coming of political age that is also a coming to liberal rational thought. Karen pointed to her political awakening emerging through volunteer work among the poor, leading to her individual choices. Alejandro studied the issues and decided to return from his bourgeois life in France. Their parents, having lived through the war and simply having lived longer lives, were not as sanguine. All of them spoke more of collective experiences during the war, of family members and classmates joining the guerrilla, disappearing. At the same time, they described their lives as individual struggles, supporting their families. Some spoke of disempowerment in the war, an inability to do anything more than to survive. Others remembered backing the efforts towards emancipation, even as they kept their heads down. Well, I'm almost done. I returned to El Salvador last year, and I hadn't been there for 3 years because of the pandemic. I kept in touch with a lot of people, but finally I went back. This was just as Bukele won his second unconstitutional term for president. I wanted to share my manuscript with all my interlocutors. It had taken a long time to interpret the distance between the 2011 protests and the 2019 vote. Training new engaged citizens to plug the whole of liberal democracy, as Alejandro had put it a decade earlier, had not held back authoritarianism. The now 3-year-old state of exception has deployed thousands of soldiers into the streets. 5 anti-mining activists had been arrested when Alejandro and I talked last year, and there's more to that story, but generational shadows were no longer chilling them, but the hopes of the post-war generation of activists were fading into memory. A number of these former indignados would tell me when I read to them if I read to them in Spanish what I had written, they would say, "Wow, it sounds like a different person." Most of them, I would say, that I spoke with, and I'm still catching up with people, most of them hold the same kinds of political convictions in the sense of support for rule of law, for stable democratic institutions. Some have good jobs, some have partners and children now, and so not all of them feel safe. One told me about how soldiers had recently confronted a close friend, an activist who had criticized the president on social media. She said, "Social movements are disarticulated. People are going clandestine." She wanted, she said, to pass the torch, so to speak, onto the new generation, she said, "But I feel like there's no one to pass it on to." There's some social movements, there's activism, there's environmental activism, feminist activism, but the larger picture is one of, oppression. The opening that the indignados and other activists had found, it had widened for a while and then is now closed. For now. As massacre survivor Miguel Marmol might have told us, we must master the art of constant rebirth. That's all. You want to ask any questions? Yeah, come on. Okay, great.
I don't know if you're going to be able to answer the question about something that's very similar to your work. Have you had a chance to speak with those participants in your research about the current agreements that Bukele has made with Trump's administration to house inmates in Salvador, in that big jail that has been built in the last few years?
No, I haven't. I mean, that just happened a little while ago. And I'm going to El Salvador next week. I'm flying on Sunday to there. So I will probably talk to some of them. But, I don't know what the answer is. I don't even think that. So that was like a proposal to send US citizens who are incarcerated to this enormous prison in El Salvador. I don't think that's legal, but not that that really bothers the government. But yeah, I haven't talked to anyone about it, but good point. I'll see what they say next week.
Thank you for your presentation. Oh, actually, I'll say in Spanish. Muchas gracias por la ponencia. Me interesó lo que dijiste cuando volvieron a leer las entrevistas o sus palabras que no los reconocían, no se reconocían a sí mismos. ¿Puedes expandir un poco más de eso? Si eso ha causado a lo mejor conversaciones con el post-war o war generation, con sus papás, con sus tíos, si ha surgido algo, o de parte también de los papás, como respuesta a ver militares en las calles nuevamente o cosas así.
Bueno, por un lado, sí, cuando digo parece como otra persona, como dicen, que no es que no reconocen las palabras tanto, es como, wow, que tantas cosas han cambiado. Y algunas veces como ya están en diferente, otra época de la vida y tienen hijos. La semana pasada hablé con otra persona y me dijo, ella ya vive en Toronto. Hay varias que viven fuera de El Salvador ahora. Ella vive en Toronto. Me dijo, wow, sí es una representación de cómo era, pero ya las cosas han cambiado. Entonces, eso es un proceso yo creo que eso pasaría con muchos de nosotros, de oír las palabras de nuestra juventud y de, ay, wow, how idealistic, whatever. Pero también de la otra parte de la pregunta, no he hablado con varias personas de la edad de sus padres, de la guerra, que han vivido la guerra, que han sufrido mucho en la guerra, han perdido personas en la guerra, no como antropóloga, pero como amiga, y ya están varios de ellos como, ya hemos sacrificado tanto, ¿y para qué? ¿Qué está pasando? O sea, que muchos han sufrido, están en el proceso de luto, pero también reconocen de varios de sus excompañeros, ya han unido con el nuevo partido, o que es una situación muy complicada. Entonces yo no, solo en el epílogo del libro voy a entrar en eso, no he pedido permiso o que no hizo un consentimiento de mis amigos de citarlo, pero voy a hablar en general sobre este proceso. Pero sí es una buena idea de pensar en cómo los ex jóvenes o no sé qué, los ex indignados están relacionando con sus padres en este momento, y no he pensado en eso. Buena pregunta.
Thanks so much for this timely, thoughtful work. I look forward to the book. I don't have a really clever way to ask the question, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about how, the indignant liberalism is a great concept. I think you've really captured it with the phrase, but I'm just thinking about like how much of your thinking is rooted. I mean, it's obviously coming out of it, thinking about the El Salvadoran situation, right? But it seems to apply increasingly across the board. So I'm just thinking about like, how are you thinking about this kind of analysis and the concept sort of traveling? How would it map out in Brazil, India, the US, something like that? And then I'm also wondering if you have thoughts about maybe how to put it, something like indignant liberalism versus indignant neoliberalism. You know, like there's some nuances in there that I can't telescope it, but I'm just kind of curious if you have some thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, because in the book, I kind of go back and I'm thinking of this broader category. So often, so many of us, and rightly, are, critiquing neoliberalism in the current moment, in the post, whatever, 1970s, 80s, in Chile, to the present. But there's something about, I think, the way that they deploy, these public goods, right? Which neoliberalism doesn't encourage us to do, right? The public goods of having courts that work. This is in the context of very, very high crime rates at that time, and having functioning judicial systems and rule of law, and also just having reliable systems of government, which becomes, for us in the United States, kind of like we didn't realize how much we actually depended or expected those to continue until now. And so in a place like El Salvador and many places in the world, I was just talking to someone earlier, like we have to learn from other places, like what to do about this. But they're used to having to fight for that. They just had the peace accords, and, there was some stability. There's many, many problems with it, as the former speakers earlier today, Amanda and was saying, and Tanya were saying that, this is all, this stability that, freedom can also mean stability. And there's a stability that we need that we didn't have before. I lost my train of thought there. But anyway, so that neoliberal, so that's why I wanted to broaden this up to think more about liberalism itself and the problems with it. I mean, there's a way in the United States where we have a very limited idea of liberals, and then in El Salvador, they'll say, actually the way I got into this was the first time I was trying to start this research, I was teaching a class at the University of El Salvador, and I asked some of them, do you know any of these indignados? And they're like, they're liberals. And I was, confused by that. But what they mean is like free marketers, neoliberals. They're on the right in a sense. It's very, even though I think of myself as a sophisticated intellectual, I was, a little bit, like it took me a minute to figure out what this broader category would be and what they were referring to and there's different meanings of it. And then I just started, especially after Bukele won and I had to rewrite the whole book, I kind of thought that that's the category that I want to think through, especially as there's, people like Orbán invented this term illiberal democracy. And so what does that mean? So this is what got me thinking about it. So that's a meandering answer to your question. Did you have something more? I forget.
Thanks so much, Ellen, for the talk. Really interesting. I'm wondering, and I guess maybe just some background for other people in the room that aren't working in El Salvador. There was a historic mining ban that was a metallic mining ban that was passed in March 2017, the first of its kind in the world. This was overturned in December of 2024. And I'm wondering if you see the growing protests against metallic mining in the country as maybe an interesting point in which the social movement will come together with the people in ways we haven't seen under the state of exception. We're seeing, I think, larger protests in San Salvador, larger than we've seen since Bukele implemented the state of exception. And of course, a lot of interest in the Santa Marta 5 case that you mentioned. But I think really interestingly on social media, there have been a lot of people who are Bukele supporters posting photographs, holding up signs saying, I'm not opposition, but I'm against mining, right? So that this could be maybe an Achilles heel for him, because up until now, it seems he can do anything he wants with a lot of support.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that's a really good question. I will see Alejandro next week, so I'll ask him. Alejandro was the second person I talked about who's an anti-mining activist and had been involved for a really long time. He made a film, he's really out there. I mean, so I'll talk to him next week. But I think, so there's a lot of really strong feminist activism. They're the ones who are also, so there are points of which people are resisting. And I think it's taken a while, especially because of, there's a state of exception there. And also people are really, really happy that you feel safer there. And I'm happy too that people feel safer. It's just, were you the ones who were saying, what's the price in human rights? Someone else was saying this, like human rights versus freedom. I mean, where do we go there? And so I think that's a really good point, and I'll think about it next week. And I talked to Alejandro and hopefully I'll see some of these protests too. So.
So I just want to give you an invitation to situate this a little bit in the global 2011 or the global, what did I say? Squares protests, right? Tahrir, like Madrid and Barcelona, Occupy, and I'm actually, I think that your perspective on like these older relatives, whether it is parents or older siblings showing up or not, right? I very much think of Occupy as a place where older, in some ways more structurally radical siblings showed up a lot, especially in New York City and Oakland, right? And we're participants and not just kind of, what do you think you're doing? But I'm wondering what, it feels like you're setting up this you're setting up liberalism as not the only alternative for mass collective defense of a better path, right? And you're kind of mourning liberalism's failure to stave off illiberal policies. And I'm wondering, like, what are the familial or not other stories that you think that you wish had had a louder voice in that moment?
Okay, so yeah.
Either way, like there's just two different pushes, right?
Okay,
like, is
so
there
2011 and
like is there another politic that you feel like was avoided in El Salvador in 2011, and or how do you see this in dialogue with the other places where there were these like plaza occupations having these conversations at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I do situate in the book a little bit more, the 2011 moment. And thank you for the question, though. And I really want to read more of your work. We had this great conversation the first day where you were just saying, something about this broader picture of social movements, which I really appreciate. Just like most of them don't last a long time, and they often are successful, but in this short-term way. And so I appreciate that. I think that if we look back at 2011, a lot of the movements weren't successful in the sense we still have them, like, we can talk about the North Africa, the Arab Spring, what happened there. We can talk about, I don't know, the successes, if we're just looking at concrete successes. But I think I was more interested in, like, in this particular movement, they were successful. Like, they got this decree overturned, but then they kind of realized they had bigger goals, and they, it was about, like, we're going to resist this polarization because people are calling us liberals, or people are calling us, like, revolutionary, they're just, no, we're different. We're a different generation. So they were defining themselves differently at that time. And it was important to them. They were stepping away from, some of them, like Karen and Alejandro both had leftist parents. I mean, I do interview a number of people who had parents that were on the right, but they found this commonality, which I think maybe, kind of happened to some extent in 2011. It's very El Salvador specific that I'm trying to broaden here and to think about. That's why I guess I use that frame of liberalism itself rather than thinking about, like, the failure of the revolution of the left, which is very palpable in El Salvador. I mean, but that broader frame of liberalism helped me think, and it isn't like liberalism is the answer as much as that's what we live in. And it's shocking how much, we took so much for granted, that things would be stable, that we'd have rule of law, that, even, private property or individual kind of rationality. And it's weird to be jolted into this moment of, like, oh yeah, that's a human, we're anthropologists. This is a human structure also. And where are we going from here? I don't know necessarily what the answer was, but I did find. That's why I made a point of citing Charles Mills. I don't know if many of you are familiar with his work, but he's got a great analysis. But then in the end, he does come back and say, but we can still hope for liberal possibilities. And I thought, well, that's, just an interesting way, instead of sort of just saying, liberals, or, the liberal failure, to think about. And now I think that actually I feel that more strongly, given what we're living through. If that makes sense. That's some of my thoughts there.
Thank you. I'm curious. So you talked about the way that different generations experienced the war differently. And there were, like, these memories of, like, yeah, there was a stray bullet, but really I didn't get affected in the same way my parents were. And I'm wondering if, in the same way that generationally there's a different relationship to that violence, that history of violence, if there's a class element to the relationship to the violence of, like, gang extortion, like, a more recent violence, but because, the question comes from, I've run into just a few Salvadorans, just like randomly, who are certainly working class and were big fans of Bukele, and their main reason was because he won against the gangs, right? And so I'm just wondering if there's a middle class element where that isn't as present for them as, like, as an achievement, or as a, seeing it as a trade-off, I guess, and whether there's a difference in the experience of violence in that way.
Yeah, I'm sure that what I talk about, thank you for that question. I mean, it's very, very urban, very middle class, very particular, not all middle class are like this too. It's like most movements are, small. They're not the majority of the population. And I just happened to stumble upon this group. I'm sure it's extremely different from the people of the same age. I actually wrote an article comparing experiences in Morazan with a Salvadoran researcher, and the research that I did in San Salvador, just showing some of those differences. So it's yeah, there's all kinds of lines of, rural, urban, not to be cliched, it's a very small country. There's a lot of overlap there, but rural, urban, class differences, whether or not you were organized or not, whether or not you experience, violence. I'm sure that, the difference between what Amanda and Tanya were talking about is palpable. Like, these are different experiences, different countries. When most of the people talked about memory of the war, it wasn't as, there were some people that had the experience of Karen's mother was pretty intense, but, for the most part, it was just different. So that leads to different ways of experiencing the world and seeing things. So I think it's important to point that out. I had a reviewer, I know who it is, who just like, you need to make sure that you say you're talking about San Salvador and not the rest of the country, because she was quite, not offended. She liked it, I hope, but she wanted me to make that point. So thank you for allowing me to emphasize that again. And then the other part of the question was, the extortions and people who live, it's true that these were, I had one, Cristina, one person who I'm hopefully going to talk to soon again, who said I don't really ever run into gangs. I mean, that was such a different experience than most people. She was just, I know they're around, and, people live, they don't even realize how much they live a life of you just don't go here, you don't go there, you don't take the bus, people, everyone's lives are incredibly circumscribed, didn't matter who you were or where you lived. It's just, there were different kinds of risks. So people all lived that. And especially the young men would talk about, having, been arrested or been, this is way before the state of exception, or just being held up or possibly being recruited. So even middle-class men would get that, especially if they were dressed in a certain way, they would get harassed too. So there were experiences, and everyone's lives were circumscribed by the violence in the gangs, but in different ways. And I think that, though they didn't initially make this connection, I think that first call for the integrity of the courts was a relationship to that kind of experience. Now, would someone who is in a poor neighborhood that had lots of gangs in it, would they want the courts to be better? No, they don't believe in the courts at all. I mean, they're like, why would I call the police? Why would I, there's complete distrust there. So again, that's a very liberal perspective, which that's why I began interested in exploring that.
Bueno, pues si no hay otras preguntas, vamos a cerrar aquí. Muchas gracias, Ellen, por esa charla tan interesante.
Thank you.